Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the lunchtime talk at the Collection Museum. We're still going digital in these strange times, but it's real pleasure to welcome our three speakers from Lincoln University today. We have with us today Dr. Craig Marsh, Professor Carenza Lewis, and Professor Heather Hughes, who've been involved in 2019 in the Digging Old Dalby archaeological test pit excavations. Really excited to hear about how they got on, what the implications of the dig and how other local people were involved in the dig. And it was a project, it's been a project that has involved partners across Europe, in the Netherlands, the Czech Republic and Poland. So very exciting, and I'll hand over to them to tell you more.
Thank you so much, Anita. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. And just to clarify, my day job is as the head of the business school at the University of Lincoln. But actually, in terms of what's relevant to this particular talk, I'm also in the Heritage Club in the village. So my role really has been as part of the Village Heritage Club. So it's a sort of hobby or interest of mine. And it's been fantastic. We got some Heritage Lottery funding a couple of years ago to support some of our work in heritage. And that's had a number of elements to it, actually, and we're just bringing those now to a conclusion over the next month or so. And both Heather and Carenza have been supporting us through some of the various aspects of this project. So Heather and Carenza are both going to talk about the support they've offered, and also just related a little bit to the wider context of supporting community heritage. So the four elements that we've had, I think, really the four main streams of this have been an archiving project, which is something that I've been working on. We've had, as part of that, we've been running some oral interviews around the village. We've had part of the project, which is creating a timeline for our village hall, which we're just coming up and finalising. We have indeed, as you've mentioned, what we call the village big dig, where we did some test pits last year with Carenza. And what we've also been doing is we've been getting understanding a little bit more about one of the features of our village, which is we have a preceptory, Knights Hospital's preceptory, buried under a field right next to the village. So we've also been getting to know that a little bit more. And on each of these aspects of the project, Carenza and Heather have been advising us. So I'm just going to bring them in stages, and they'll tell us a little bit more about how they've been supporting the village project. So I'll start with Heather. So Heather, perhaps I could bring you in, and you could just say a little bit about the work that you've been doing to support the village project. Heather?
Thanks, Craig, and thanks, Anita, for having us. Yes, my day job is also working in the Lincoln International Business School with Craig, and what is housed in the International Business School is a very ambitious digital archive, because we are partners with the International Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln, and we have been constructing an archive since 2015 for that project. But through that work, we have developed a lot of expertise, I think, in digital archive management. And apart from the fact that this has been a great teaching resource, it has also enabled us to share our accumulated knowledge a bit more widely in the community. So we've done, this was probably our first proper community project, and it was hugely rewarding for us, I think, and we hope that we, have imparted some know-how to the folks who were involved in collecting heritage in Old Dalby. So what we did was we ran 2 workshops. We actually had planned more, but people were such fast learners that we discovered we didn't need too many more workshops, because they had what they needed just to go out and start building the archive. So we ran these workshops to convey basic principles of digital archiving. If you're going to do it properly, it's a bit more than just posting things as you would on Facebook. There's quite a lot of backroom stuff that you need to be able to manage. So we ran these 2 workshops. People were hugely enthusiastic. I think the feedback from the villagers who participated was fantastic. The group had 2 collecting days in the village hall, which Craig might want to say a little bit more about, that were you know, people brought stuff. It wasn't just collecting oral testimony. People brought old photographs and old theatre programs and all sorts, which are now going to be sort of ingested into that digital archive.
Indeed.
So that project is up and running.
Still doing the archiving, Heather, and then absolutely right. If I may, one of the things that happened is that both of the work that Heather and Carenza have done have created a real sense of community around the village as well. So it wasn't just a one-to-one thing about people bringing in as engaged in it. We actually ran it as a village event, and that was one of the things that really added a massive value to the project. Heather, thank you.
Yeah, so that project continues. So even though our involvement formally ended in late 2019, the village archive will go on, hopefully growing and growing and growing. And I must just say the exciting moment, which I think will live with us all in the archive a long time, was in November when we visited, and Craig was present, and we took him through the steps of how to make the digital archive live for the first time, and it was just such an exciting moment for everybody there, to realize that all of this hard work had actually led to something that other people could use and share. So it's a brilliant way of sharing resources in a village. And then the other part of the project, in a sense, the digital archive led to the next thing that I've been involved in. This is all indoor work. Carenza is going to talk about the fun outdoor work, but the other indoor piece of work that I've now been involved with is this timeline, because one of the things that the Heritage Group wanted to do in the village was to create out of a lot of the information that has come to light, and I can tell you some of it has been wonderful, the information that's come to light about the history of the village. Wanted to reflect all of this on a timeline which will be fixed to a wall in the village hall, putting it all together. And we're almost at the end of that project. We are finalizing all the memories on the timeline. At the moment, we're just assembling the last few images that need to go onto the timeline, and then the whole thing will be laid out and designed on clear perspex, and it will look beautiful in the village hall, I'm sure. But yeah, so we're nearly at the end of that part of the project, and hopefully there will be a village feast and a celebration when all of this finally comes together. But over to you, Carenza, to talk about your part in the project now.
Okay, thanks very much, Heather. It's really great to be working on a project where there's lots of different activity going on in the village and sort of bringing everyone together. So what I'm going to talk about is, as has been heralded, the test pit excavations in the village. So for those of you who don't know where Old Dalby is, here it is, and these are some of the people who are involved in this project. But as again has already been mentioned, this was part of actually a much bigger project extending across 4 countries, in the Netherlands, the Czech Republic and Poland. And in 2019, as well as the work in Old Dalby, there was work in 4 different communities in Het Groenwoud in the Netherlands. You can see where the yellow balloons are. In Myslinka in the Czech Republic, and Cecina in Poland. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but the methodology that we were all using was one that was first brought, I think, to widespread knowledge through Time Team's Big Dig in 2003, when in a previous existence I used to be part of that. And that'll show you how long ago it is, as there's a picture of the TV that it was broadcast on. And this was this process of using these 1 meter square test pits to kind of sample quite big places. The place that we were sampling is these historic settlements. This is a technique that I used very widely before I came to Lincoln from the University of Cambridge. Here you can see Eastern England. Each of those black dots is one of these villages where we've carried out some of these test pit excavations. Some have just had half a dozen or so, some, well, one's had more than 100, and a lot of them have had 30, 40, 50, 60 or so. And this has taught us an awful lot about the development of these settlements and about some of the bigger historical phenomena. So just as one example, we could see the impact of the Black Death plague pandemic, for example. Here you can see, again, that same region of Eastern England. The bigger the red dot, the more densely populated the village is, as indicated by the amount of pottery that was being produced from the sites in the villages. Here you can see before the Black Death, and there you can see afterwards. And you can see, I think, particularly in the area in the sort of left hand of that map, how all these villages have just shriveled away, really. 90% of these settlements we dug in had some sort of degree of contraction after the Black Death, and overall the number of inhabited sites dropped by 45%. And that showed that this test pit excavation method could reconstruct, change over time, place by place, village by village, street by street, in fact. But what it also showed us, because we were doing these excavations with members of the public, we started off running it as a schools programme to raise educational aspirations and build skills for higher education in the Higher Education Field Academy. And it quickly developed into community projects where the villages that we've been digging in wanted to get involved themselves. And we had over 10,000 people take part in this in the UK in various sorts of ways. And we collected a lot of data on the impact of this, so I won't go through the screen in detail, but the graph at the top shows the number of people who would recommend this activity to others, with obviously the vast majority saying yes, one or two saying maybe, and actually none of them saying no. We had some good data on the sort of impact it has in terms of people's sense of interest and engagement, both with their local archaeology and history, and with archaeology and history more generally. That's the graph at the bottom left-hand side of the page there. And this is from some excavations on a council estate in Lincolnshire. So you don't have to have a ready-made historic site there to get some interesting archaeology and to do something which people enjoy. And the pie charts that you can see on the right-hand side there are showing the impact that it had on skills, particularly among the teenagers we worked with in all these various different sorts of activities, or these different sorts of skills, if you like. And they're not just good skills for school or even just for university, they're good sort of workplace, professional, career, life skills as well, verbal communication, creative thinking, and so on. So we had quite a good idea of the sort of benefits that these kind of projects can deliver to people who get involved in them, both as individuals, the benefits to local communities, and the benefits to wider society. And I'm not going to read through that slide now because I just don't have time, but you can see that there, and if you're watching it in post-record, you can freeze it if you want to have a closer look. Because we were aware of these sorts of benefits, and because this sort of participative community archaeology where people take part is not widely available beyond the UK, a couple of years ago we got a grant for a project that was extending this test pit excavation into other countries. We started this last February 2019, in this community archaeology in rural environments project known as CARE for short, the acronym for the title. And this is where Old Dalby came in, because we wanted a UK village to be involved in this as well. I'd previously done a talk in the village, so I knew they might be interested. And so when I was looking for a village to draw into the European project, I got in touch, and they were brilliant in pulling together this project really quickly. And it's a good example, really, of when you get a community that's starting to engage with heritage in this way, how one thing can lead to another and build up into something really quite big and new and unique and exciting. So we did the digging there on the 19th and 20th of October last year, so barely, 9 months ago now. And this is Old Dalby here. You can see the main area of the village is on the left-hand side there. And we did one test pit out at Queensway, Old Dalby as well, which is a modern settlement on the site of a previous military base there. This is the location for test pits. We did 8 within the main village and 1 out at Queensway. The green squares show the location of each test pit. I would point out they're not shown to scale. If I showed them to scale, because they're just a metre square, you wouldn't be able to see them. If they really were the size that you can see them on that map, they'd be 70, 80, 90, 100 metres across, which would be very informative, but much more time consuming. There was little known about the archaeology of the village before that. Some excavation had been done in advance of development, sort of between test pits 1 and 7, which are the 2 on the right-hand side of the screen, and to produce some medieval pottery, 12th, 13th, 14th century. The area of sort of where it says former settlement is where there's some earthworks, some humps and bumps in the ground, running up on the east side, the southeast side of Paradise Lane there. In the, what's now just the grassy field, the earthworks were surveyed quite a long time ago now by Fred Hartley working in that area. And they'd also then picked up the earthworks of the preceptory. Originally a Knights Templars preceptory, then a Hospitallers preceptory, a sort of a monastic site, of which there's no trace apart from a few humps and bumps in the ground. As you can see from the location of the test pits, we were focusing on the settlement, the existing village. Obviously, with only 8 test pits, we couldn't cover all of it. And when you look at the earlier map, so this is a map from 150 years ago, the first edition Ordnance Survey map. The map's exactly the same scale, the test pits are in the same place, but you can see how different the village looked at that time. It's much smaller. The test pits on the northern side, the top side of the map, really look like they're out of the village altogether. There's no housing around that. And even the centre of the existing village, in the centre of the map, looks very gappy. There's sort of 2 or 3 cottages, then a gap, then a paddock, then a few more cottages. The church in the village is down on the south side, just to the left-hand side of the settlement preceptory. It's marked with a big black cross there, just to make it easier to see. So as you can see, the church is very much on the edge of the village, both as it is today and as it was in 1880. So when we came to do the excavations, what turned up? Well, I'll go through these in order, and they were numbered slightly randomly, so we'll jump around a little bit. But for each of these maps, you can see which test pit I'm talking about because it's outlined in red here. So the first test pit was up in the school, which is a modern school building. As you can see, in 1880, there's absolutely nothing around it at all. So we were really surprised, in fact, then when we actually found 3 sherds of Stamford ware, which is pottery that can date from any time between about 850, 900 through to about 1150. So that's from the time of, say, Alfred the Great through to well after the Norman Conquest, in fact. 3 sherds of it suggests that's not just one tiny little casual loss. They weren't very big, though, so they've clearly been probably abraded by being moved about in the plough over the 1,000 years that may have elapsed since that pottery was used and broken and thrown away. But it does hint at the possibility there was actually some sort of settlement nearby, because 3 sherds is quite a lot for that period. So that was interesting for a start. A complete reverse surprise was test pit 2, which you can see here right down near the church. It was the closest test pit we dug to the church. The church is a medieval building. You kind of might expect the medieval settlement to be near the medieval church. But actually, this test pit produced nothing predating the 18th century. Now, that may just be a bit of a fluke. It was certainly a bit of a surprise. It had some quite deep brown soils, looked like good habitation, but no early pottery at all. That suggests either there's a big green or open space around the church, perhaps that the church was then still on the edge of the settlement, or perhaps just that we just happened not to get any pottery from that. So both of the first 2 test pits were surprising, but in very different ways. Test pit 3 was in the centre of the present village along Chapel Lane, just on the north of what's now a small green. As you can see, that produced finds literally by the shovelful. As you can see from the picture here, and there's a couple of boys from the village are digging the test pit. You can see the family whose garden it was there. We had a huge amount of pottery from this, mostly, well, all of it 15th century or later. But it suggests that plot of land was quite intensively inhabited from maybe 1400, 1500 onwards. And there are also some nice little finds suggesting a sort of slightly higher standard of life when we get into the 17th, 18th, 19th century. So there's a nice little sort of worked bone button here, and quite a lot of bits of decorated clay tobacco pipe as well. Test pit 4, it was the furthest to the left of the test pits, as you can see here, outlined in red. Very similar collection of pottery, not quite as much, but same sort of date range from the 15th, 16th century onwards, so inhabited perhaps from about 1500 onwards. And again, with some nice sort of bits of worked bone. You can see that sort of strangely shaped bit of bone with a drilled hole in it. It's clearly been used to make something. And again, another bone button. These are probably 17th, 18th century in date. On the green that I mentioned in the centre of the village, oops, that hasn't been outlined in red there, but it's very much in the centre of the village, test pit 5 there. Very clayey test pit. You might be able to see a little bit of water collecting already there, slightly higher ground in the middle of the village. And this produced not a great deal of pottery, just a little from the 15th, 16th century, and then really not a huge amount until we're into the 19th century, suggesting perhaps that it was the village green throughout the 15th, 16th century and onwards, at a period when there's other two test pits that have more pottery and the bone bits and pieces. That's where people are living, and the green was an empty space. And you can see a quite nice horseshoe we got from that test pit as well. Test pit 6 is on another sort of empty plot in the centre of the village, and you can see where this is marked in red here. So test pit 5 with the horseshoe, it's the one immediately sort of to the left and above test pit 6 that's outlined here. This produced absolutely no pottery whatsoever. The items you can see in the finds tray there are in fact bits of broken drain pipe. But you can see it feels like it's quite in the centre of the village, and you can see the church tower in the back there, suggesting perhaps that this green was quite large in the centre of the village, even from the 15th, 16th century. And there's no sign of anything medieval there. Test pit 7, you can see that outlined in red here on the bottom right-hand corner. This was the closest one to the area of deserted medieval settlement that I mentioned, and in fact, looking through the fence that you can see there, you can see very clearly the earthworks, the humps and bumps of the ground of that area of former settlement. This had a large and keen team here digging there, and they were quite right to be keen there because they produced a large amount of medieval pottery, right back to Stamford ware, the late Anglo-Saxon, Norman Conquest period pottery, going on right through, and you can see what this pottery looks like. It's not sort of exciting and shiny to look at, sort of coarse earthenwares really, but very, very interesting because it's old. There's a lot of it, but it stopped pretty much dead after the 15th century and possibly even before that. And then finally, test pit 8 in the pub. You might think that doesn't look much like a pub garden to you. They put the test pit right at the far end of it, which brought it closer into what's the centre of the village now, and kept it safely away from people who are just trying to have a quiet drink, I think, probably. But you can see, again, this is the on the northwestern side of the village there, outlined in red. This, again, because we thought it was outside the centre of the village, which we rather thought was around the green in the middle area where those two test pits produced a lot of pottery, we were quite surprised, actually, that this produced, again, medieval pottery, and pottery then going up to about the 14th century and was then abandoned until fairly recently. The 14th century is, of course, the century when the Black Death struck. And in fact, the first place that I went out to in terms of sort of a work-related social meeting was this village pub, which of course had been closed for the coronavirus pandemic. If it was abandoned after the 14th century pandemic, it's clearly not the first time that pub's been shut because of a plague. And here you can see some of the pottery. Again, doesn't look flashy and shiny, but that makes it more interesting. Lots of tobacco clay pipe there, and this is often the case with pub gardens. People would have bought could have bought sort of ready-filled clay tobacco pipes, ready to smoke without having to do much to them. And the shape that you can see at the bottom there is the spur at the bottom of a clay tobacco pipe in the shape of a bull's head, and our research suggested this might well have been to do with the Royal Antediluvian Order of Buffaloes, which is a kind of charitable, church-related sort of Mason-type group who may well have met in the pub, and they had these sort of custom-made tobacco pipes. Oh, and if you want to check up on them, they are indeed still online. The final test pit was out at the Marquis Avenue in Queensway. One of the, again, Heather was talking and Craig was mentioning about the community bringing in new pieces of information. One of the things that was brought along when the test pits were being dug was this diagram of the layout of the military base when that was in existence. Here you can see that map, and the green square marks where the test pit was, which is just on the southern edge of this compound, just at the entrance to it. It produced, again, only recent pottery, just one bit from the 18th century and a couple of bits from the 19th century. It did produce a very nice cap badge, again, from the Cheshire Regiment here. You can see on the green background the fragments from the excavation and what the original item would have looked like. So pulling all of this together, everyone brought their finds into the village hall, which is where the timeline is going to be installed. Pulling it together, looking at what this tells us about the story through time. Here's the maps of Old Dalby and of Queensway. The squares that are white are test pits that didn't produce pottery for any given historical period, and the black and grey circles are test pits that did produce pottery for those periods. And it is interesting and unexpected, because I think we sort of expected that most of the earliest settlement, the Anglo-Saxon settlement perhaps, and certainly the medieval village up to about 1500, would be down near where those earthworks of the settlement were, right on the southeast, the bottom right-hand corner of the map. And as you can see from this map, in fact, we had pottery of this 9th to 11th century date from 3 separate locations in the village, separated by about 300 meters. Those would conventionally be regarded as separate settlements. There's too much space between them for them to be all sort of one settlement. So it looks as if there's a dispersed pattern of settlement at that date, because of course the test pits in between are not producing pottery at that date. That said, only 8 test pits is quite a small number, so using the negative evidence to say, well, we didn't find anything, therefore there was nothing there, slightly too few to do that. But definitely the fact we've got those 3 finds of pottery suggests we've got a different sort of pattern of settlement than we expected. When we go through into the 12th to 14th century, so this is the high medieval period, the period sort of up to the Black Death, really. We can see we've got 2, again, quite distinct nodes of settlement. One down on the southeast near those settlement earthworks, and the other down up on the top right-hand, top left-hand corner. That's the pub. And you can see how far apart those areas are, with nothing from any of those test pits in between. And then into the late 14th to early 16th centuries, this is the period after the Black Death, but also significantly the period after, or edges into the period at which the preceptory would have been abandoned when Henry VIII dissolved all of the monasteries. And you can see from this into that period, we've got those 2 grey circles, are those 2 test pits that had lots of pottery. So we've definitely got a cluster of what looks like test pits together in the centre of the village. It looks like we've got a nucleated settlement at that point, but there's also continuing settlement down on the edge of the settlement earthworks. And then into the 16th to 18th centuries, that test pit number 7 by the edge of the settlement earthworks is producing nothing. And we've clearly got the test pits in the centre of the village are the ones that are producing pottery of that date. So in the sort of Tudor, Stuart, Georgian sort of period, we've got a compact nucleated village. And then, of course, into the 19th and 20th centuries, the village is growing. And for the first time, we've got Queensway coming into the picture. So just to put that into a little bit of wider context, you remember I showed you the slide of where all the sites that we worked on in Eastern England, East Anglia, were excavated. The black line here shows the trajectory through time of the average of all those, in fact, 75 settlements that we looked at in East Anglia, more than 2,500 test pits throughout the country. The black shows the average, and you can see there's very little prehistoric material, a bit of up to about 9% of test pits producing pottery in the Roman period, drops in the early and middle Anglo-Saxon, picks up in the late Anglo-Saxon, big climb up to the high medieval, sharp drop after the 14th century, the century of the Black Death, and then a quite equally sharp climb afterwards. And what's really interesting is you can see the line for Old Dalby really doesn't follow that at all. We have no prehistoric or Roman material at all from it, but then only, 9% of pits produce Roman pottery, only about 2% produce prehistoric or early Anglo-Saxon. So with only 8 test pits dug, we might not have expected any. But what we can see is there's perhaps slightly more of the late Anglo-Saxon material than we expect on average. And what it doesn't seem to have is this post-Black Death drop. And there's then a gentler climb afterwards. So it's an unexpected place, really, generally. And we can actually then, this is the graphs of all of the villages beyond East Anglia that we've worked in. Don't worry too much about the detail of which place is which, but you can see them marked on the map of England there. And you can see how common this same trajectory, that typically East Anglian trajectory, is in these other areas, fit in the road and drop afterwards, climbing Anglo-Saxon, right up in the high medieval, drop after the 14th century, climb afterwards. You can see that some places do buck that trend. So you can see that Great Bowden, for example, in purple, is clearly doing something really quite different. And Bardney, again in Lincolnshire, is also not showing a post-Black Death drop. So the other thing we did at Old Dalby, in fact, one of the main reasons we were there, was to collect some data on the impact of the project. So we had some students from the University of Lincoln who went out taking out questionnaires, because one of the aims of our European project was to advance understanding of how and why community archaeology benefits people, that provides societal benefits. As you can see highlighted in red there. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this in any detail, but we used a questionnaire with quite a lot of questions, which people participating in the excavations filled in before they started and after they finished. And then people living in the village who weren't participating in the excavations also filled in the questionnaire as a control group. And this has allowed us, for the first time, combining the data from Old Dalby with data from the Netherlands, 2 of the villages in the Netherlands as well, who filled in exactly the same survey, only translated into Dutch, obviously. For the first time, we have this experimental data with before and after data that can be compared with a control group that can show the psychological benefits of taking part in this, which is increased sense of community identification, the feeling you belong to the place, social support, of feeling that the place is something you can rely on, and the people there you can turn to, perceived group continuity, your sense of past, present and future, having roots in a place, your attachment to a place, your general life satisfaction, and a range of 8 different positive emotions. And these are all factors that are really important for well-being, which is being increasingly recognised as fundamental to how well people experience their lives. So Old Dalby is the first place that has been able to provide this before and after with control group data. Of course, finally, to think really, it's It's not only in Old Dalby. This exact same activity has been taking place in the Netherlands, as you can see here, those same 1 metre square pits. In Poland, here on the village green in the centre of the village in China. And again in Vanderbice in the Czech Republic, exactly those same 1 metre square test pits. So everyone across the continent is carrying out this same activity. And some of this is even carried on this year. So some of the pictures are actually from Vanderbice. They're actually from this year when the Czech Republic didn't have as early a problem with, or didn't have a serious problem early in 2020 with coronavirus, and was able to get out and do some field work. What's next? Well, just to quickly go over, and I'm probably running over here, just to quickly go over the other activity. Of course, there could be more test pit digging, and I'm wondering if the Buffalo Society might like to help with that. But the other thing we looked at was the preceptory site. Craig alluded to the fact there's been a geophysical survey done there. This is an aerial photograph showing this, which actually when you put it into sight, you can see the aerial photograph just covers that area just south of the village there. You can see the earthworks have just been highlighted there. In fact, if I just take the picture off there, you can see where you've got the remains of the village in the top of the area, the insert area there. And you can see how the earthwork boundaries there in orange very much mirror the boundaries the other side of Paradise Lane. So it looks like we've got a double row village extending northeast of the church there. Looking at that in a bit more detail, the geophysical survey, having had a look at the data and a think about it, it didn't provide some terribly clear indications of, it certainly didn't give us a date, and it didn't enable us to reconstruct precisely what the buildings were at all. And these sorts of hospitals preceptories can have very variable layouts, so it's difficult to predict quite how they've been laid out. Some monasteries have very regular layouts and you can work out exactly what's going to be where. Not the case with these preceptories. But what the geophysical survey did tell us was there's clearly solid archaeology under there. So there are definitely features there, should the community wish to try and focus their future excavations on either the preceptory or the area of deserted earthworks rather than the inhabited village. So that is where we've got to so far. So really, it's up to the Old Dalbians to decide what next, bearing in mind the work's still continuing in Europe.
It sounds like Craig's got more of a job to do in the village then now, haven't you? I think
yeah, very much so.
It was really lovely also to see on the primary school website how really excited they were to be part of the project, and listening to everything that the three of you have said. I really would like to invite you to my village to have a look at, you know, I'm sure we could do something similar. I
was visiting a site on Saturday, a completely different site. It was a Roman site out in eastern Lincolnshire, but and there was somebody there who dug with us an old clee when we were doing some test pit digging there. We were talking about the idea of a county-wide project. Perhaps we should do something. Leicestershire and Lincolnshire would be great.
Okay, well, I hope all our listeners who are listening to this talk today take note of that, and you can get in touch. Thank you very much to Craig, Carenza and Heather for sharing this really exciting and interesting project, and you brought a lot to our lunchtime talks. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Very kind. Thank you very much, Anissa.
Thank you very much. That's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.